The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Don't Ignore Outliers. Hey everybody, hope you're well. We're going to do a little math today, but don't worry, you're not going to have to see any calculations or do any calculations. I'm not going to show you a formula, and the closest will come, and I'll probably just do this now just to show it. This is a Galton board, which exists primarily to demonstrate kind of a normative bell curve distribution. And all it is a bunch of balls that fall down. And you can see they consistently do this. But you can use this to teach this basic principle of math. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a statistician. I'm not going to be asking you to be one either. But we are going to talk about a couple concepts. And if any of this is wrong, feel free to post a comment down below. I'm unlikely to actually update and correct the video unless I've made an egregious error, but I will pin notes and put comments down below in the description. A quick note, you guys know I almost never do this, for patrons, because my content is supported by patrons and then given out for free to everybody on this YouTube channel where you're watching it now. Apple is changing some of its policies. If you are a patron that is going through Apple's service right now, I'm going to be releasing a video for patrons only with instructions on how you can change your subscription model. Hopefully you will decide to continue supporting this channel and my work here, but I'm not going to spend any more time on this video with it other than to say that change is coming soon, and I will let patrons know. And if you're not currently a patron and would like to be, patreon.com/atheistdebates will allow you to go in and support this creation and others as well. There are things you don't need to know, but you can quickly learn. When we're talking about statistics, there are concepts like mean, median, mode, standard deviation. And all of them have to do with assessing and describing a set of data. And the only thing to remember is that your set of data is some portion of a particular population. And I don't mean like the population of the world. Yes, that's a population, but so is the population of Nebraska. And so is the population of blonde-headed children. So is the population of my house, although there's only the two of us since we don't get to sample any of the reptiles for most things. But we could have a sample of reptiles in my house and do data on them. That's one of the things we do when we're tracking the health of our animals and how often they eat and things like that. The median is the center point of the data. There may or may not be an actual piece of data that represents the actual center point. If there's an odd number, then it's whatever the middle number is. No matter how anything else, no matter how much it represents any portion of the rest of the data, whatever the middle number is the median. And if there's an even number of data points, then you average the two that would be at the middle point when listed from lowest to highest. The mode is the most frequent number. If you have like 4, 5, 6, 5, 7, 5, 5, 8, 5, 9, 9, 3, 2, 5, 5, then 5 becomes essentially the mode because that's the number that appears most. These things have a use in statistics that I'm not even going to attempt to go into or pretend that I fully understand. When most of us talk about the average, we're talking about the mean, and that's where you add up all of the data, all the numerical data, and divide it by the total. It's just what we all think of generally as average. And then standard deviation is basically how much deviation there is in the data, how much from whatever that mean, that average is, how many are above it, not specifically how many, but what is the mark of departure, how varied the data can be. And we divide that up into things called, I say we, as if I've done it, blah, blah, blah. So 1 sigma of standard deviation means that, for example, the average IQ is always 100, and 1 sigma is 15 points. I'm not going to go through the calculations for this, but what it means is that 1 sigma from the mean represents 68% of the data set. 2 sigma from the mean represents 95% of the data set. And 3 sigma from the mean represents 99.7%. So that's where you get the bell curve going out like that. And at some point you are 3 sigma away, which means All the remaining data in there represents less than 0.3% of the entire sample. That's it. 1 sigma means you're this far and within 68% of that data population. 2 sigma puts you that far and you're 95%, and 3 is 99.7%. So for example, in IQ, as I mentioned, the the mean is going to be 100, and or I guess you could also call it the median because it's the center point of that curve. The sigma, or the standard deviation, is 15 points. So 99.7% of the population falls between 55 IQ and 145 IQ. The height of the average U.S. man is 5 foot 10 inches, and each sigma is 3 inches. So 1 sigma takes you from 5'7" to 6'2", and that represents 68% of the population. All that those information, those labels are doing, mean, median, mode's not as descriptive, but standard deviation, all of the issues of variance are describing the curve of the data. How tall is it? How wide is it? How steep is the drop off to the curve? Statistical outliers can be a problem, because if we have the numbers that I rattled off earlier that were all, under 20, and then we have an additional number that's 743, all of a sudden our average, or our mean, is in a place that is inconsistent with the bulk of the data, all because there was one outlier. And statisticians have to make a decision. What are they going to do about those outliers? This is why we have different labels for different calculations, mean, median, mode, etc. Because in some cases, that outlier is significant and perhaps should be referenced in a different data set because we've made some mistake. But in some cases, it's an error. It's a sampling bias. We posted a poll to Twitter, and so you're only going to get answers from people on Twitter, which means it might, if Twitter as a sample of the population isn't representative, then your sample data is not going to be representative. It could also be an actual error. If we're taking down, how many points were scored in the game the other night, and it's 3, 4, 5, 10, 3, 9, 7, 2, 732, it's unlikely that somebody scored that many points in the game, but, we should perhaps look into it. So sometimes you want to dig in more on the outliers, and sometimes you want to set them aside. But what you don't get to do is pretend that the outliers don't exist at all. And we're seeing some of that because our tendency as we begin to learn more about data and we're using it is to constantly move towards normative assessments. So that becomes a problem if we begin talking about, for example, people's rights. I'm an atheist. I'm a secular humanist. I fit into a number of different categories. And so all the various data points about me, when put into plots of data, I could be dead center at the median. I could be right at the mean. I could be part of the mode. I could be the most common person out there, or I could be a statistical outlier. It depends on what we're trying to find out and what we've sampled in the data. But we don't get to say, you know what? There's 1,000 Christian denominations, and we're gonna consider all of them and rank them and everything else, but we'll just throw out the atheists. That atheists are outliers when it comes to religious denominations, and there's no reason to include or even go to specific Christian denominations. It's not like atheists are just atheists about a Christian God. And so atheists are the outliers for that. But when we're talking about religious identity, atheists must be included as part of the data set. If you were to throw them out of the religious identity set, that would be a huge mistake, especially considering, depending on where you are in the world, there could be anywhere from none to 15, 16, 20, 30, 40, 50% of your population might be getting tossed out. I've heard statistics saying that as many as 50% of Jews in Israel are secular. Doesn't mean they're necessarily atheistic, but secular in some way or another. And so if you were to throw out secular Jews, you'd be throwing out a huge chunk of the population. So the terms that the statisticians and mathematicians use to describe the curve, describe the data set, are separate from what we're actually focusing on with the data set. In the United States, 0.6% of people over 13, so we're already throwing out people under 13, and for good reasons at this point, 0.6% of people over 13 identify as transgender. But that's 1.6 million people, give or take. And that is within 3 sigma of standard deviation. So if you are looking at, hey, this as a portion of our total population, it's 0.6%, give or take, then that's well within 3 sigma. And so trans folks, for example, aren't even outliers of the general population. And they shouldn't be treated as outliers. But what about left-handed trans men? That's definitely outside of the 99.7%. Do they get to be ignored? Well, they might be, depending on the actual topic that we're focused on. If we're not worried about left-handed people, if we're not worried about any of the specific characteristics that get us down, because any one of us on some chart could be outside of 3 sigma, depending on what the focus of the data set is. See, you don't get to just dismiss outliers when we're talking about people. You have normal or normative distributions, but we don't get to ignore atheists when we're talking about religious identity, because atheism does have some sort of religious identity. In many cases, it's none, as in none of the above. And it would be a mistake to toss out the people who aren't part of that because they don't fit in under a certain description. So, do we get to ignore atheists when talking about Christian doctrine? Yeah. And do we get to ignore atheists when we're talking about Christian denominations? Yeah. But that doesn't mean that they don't exist, and that doesn't mean they're not relevant to different sets like religious identity or any number of other broader topics. Do we get to ignore the very tall people and the very short people when we're designing buildings? Yeah. We can take a representative sample of the population and say, you know what, we're going to set our building tolerances to within 3 sigma, within 3 standard deviations of the norm. And the people who are outside of that, the 0.3% that aren't fit in there, they can buy custom houses. They can have things modified. The people who are shorter or taller than that 99.7%, we're just not going to consider them because it's not cost effective. It's not resource effective. It is much more effective for us to make sure that those people potentially have resources to get custom houses done or to make modifications to existing houses. It is better when we're living in a world where things are mass produced and produced to a standard. But it doesn't mean those people don't exist, and it doesn't mean they don't have rights, and it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be considered. The outliers that we set aside from a sample are set to a specific person. It's a purpose for that data. We don't get to ignore the very tall or the very short across the board. We don't get to pretend that they don't exist, but we don't get to say that people always fit within 3 sigma of the norm, because that's false. There's 0.3% that are outside of 3 standard deviations. We don't get to say they don't exist. Now, it's the same thing with genders. And by the way, this video wasn't intended to just be about gender, but this is coming up. How many genders are there? I don't know. And I don't care. How do we figure out which box to put people in? Well, it's really easy to sit here and say, I don't know, and I'm really not that interested in putting people into boxes and putting labels on things, but we do. And the truth is, I am interested to some extent on those boxes. So how do we figure out which box to put people in if sex isn't gender, gender isn't sex, sex isn't binary, gender isn't binary? Yes, I know there are biology professors and authors in the secular community that will stand up and say, sex is binary, and then quickly throw out, as long as we dismiss the outliers. Well, sex is binary if you ignore the statistical outliers, but you also don't get to do that because we're talking specifically about those people. As soon as we start talking about atheists, they're no longer the outliers. And as soon as we start talking about trans people, they're no longer the outliers. They are the focus of the data set. When we talk about atheists, theists become the outliers. When we talk about LGBTQIA folks, cis straight people become the outliers. What is the source and purpose of the data set? Because the sample isn't the same as the population. And not all populations are equal or equally represented in a given sample. An outlier in one data set will be the mean, median, or mode of some other data set. If you build a house where everything is based on the data set of NBA players' heights, that house is going to be less appealing to the general public. You're going to have spent money for something that 0.3% of the population is likely to find appealing, unless there's somebody with, some sort of fetish where they want to live in a house where they feel tiny, like they've entered the Jolly Green Giants vicinity. And the opposite is true as well. If you build a house that's designed for people who are on the very short end, people with various forms of dwarfism or whatever, if you build a house that was perfect for them, that's only going to satisfy that tiny portion of the population, no pun intended, because average sized people from the broader population and incredibly tall people, they're not going to fit and work in those spaces. But it's absolutely fine to build things like that. It's just not a good business decision in a world where we are manufacturing things to a standard. Ducking to get into every single room is going to be very annoying. But we don't do home tours and say, well, nobody is that tall, except for the people that we're ignoring. And it may be okay to ignore those people in the way that I'm talking about for standards. But if Yao Ming, who's 7'6", is touring the house, grab yourself a stepladder so you can look him in the eye when you try to explain to him that nobody is as tall as him. That is, to some extent, how atheist people are likely to feel in a world that seems to be tailored to religious mindsets. It's how trans people might feel in a world that's tailored to cis identity. It's how tall people feel in a world. Anybody who is on the fringes of a particular data set has the potential to be ignored in ways that are detrimental and ignored in ways that are justified. I don't need to be considered at the next Southern Baptist convention when they're talking about what they're going to put out as their next position statement or the update of their doctrine, their statement of theology and their statement of faith. My thoughts, well, I'd love it if they'd start considering my thoughts, but there's no reasonable expectation that as an atheist, I could or should be part of that consideration. So we didn't actually go into details on math. If you want, by all means, you can go watch videos on mean, median, modes, standard deviations. You can talk about variation, all that stuff. The important thing to remember is that we're finding better ways to categorize things and understand them and describe those things. And when it comes to statistical analysis, we have a ways of describing what normal distributions are likely going to be. We can demonstrate them physically with things like the Galton board, but we already know this from the mathematics. The math works out in reality. And it's fine to ignore left-handed people if you're studying right-handed people. But it's not fine to ignore left-handed people if you're studying people. And when you're talking about sex and sexuality, when you're talking about what is or isn't binary, very few things are truly binary. And when people talk about biological sex but biologically there's this. My friend Forrest Valkai likes to point out that, well, when you say biologically, are you talking anatomically, as in what the actual internal sex organs are? Are you talking phenotypically as to what the external presentation is? And by the way, phenotype applies to the internal things as well. It's just that you can't typically see them. It's still present in the phenotype if you were to, start dissecting people. But then are you talking about hormonal? Because that's what guides development, which is why trans people end up on hormones and why cis people also end up on hormones to correct for hormone deficiencies and things like that. Are you talking about chromosomal? Because that's also not binary, because there's XX, XY, XXY, and others. And what ends up happening is that, well, we're not going to talk about anything other than XX or XY. And that's fine. You can talk about normative distribution. The biological sex graph is probably almost like a spike in the sense that it's not a very wide distribution of possible outcomes. But in addition to anatomic, phenotypic, hormonal, or chromosomal, there's also genetic. And that's often confused with chromosomal because your chromosomes can carry genes or not carry genes. So if you're missing the gene on your chromosome that would normally produce the secondary and tertiary sex characteristics associated with that chromosome, then now what you're saying is I'm chromosomally this sex, but not genetically this sex. Or I'm genetically this sex, but not chromosomally this sex. Or I'm not hormonally this sex, or I'm not phenotypically this sex. So even within biology, there's a lot of options. But when we talk about gender normatively in the modern world, we're talking about an intersection between biological sex, all of those different things that Forrest talked about, which aren't binary, sociological constructs about gender roles and presentation, what kind of clothes people wear, how they're going to do their hair, how they're going to wear makeup, all of those things that society made up about here's how I'm going to show that I'm in this group. So there's the biological, the sociological, and then there's the psychological, which is all about the internal present or the internal perception of oneself and where one fits in. You can do something similar to this for other categories as well. I don't know of any biologically atheist categories, but sociologically, an atheist, a secular humanist, a freethinker, those could be different categories of within the sociological spectrum, how we're going to categorize people. And then under the psychological spectrum, it could be about what you actually are convinced is true or not true. There are people like me who aren't convinced that anything supernatural is real. When people talk about higher power, I have to ask them to define what do you actually mean, because I definitely think that there are people smarter than me and potentially things smarter than us. And for any given data point about who we are as humans, there may be something else out there, but that doesn't mean that there's a God. And so when we're starting to put categorizations to things, it's good to recognize that your data can never be better for a particular purpose than the reliability and accuracy of your sample size and how representative that sample is. And if you've asked the wrong question to begin with, if your data set is about how many different chromosomal options are there when talking about trans people, you've completely missed the point. And you don't get to, well, there's almost no intersex peoples, therefore chromosomal sex is binary. Yeah, chromosomal sex is normally binary. It's probably modally binary. But that doesn't mean it's actually binary in either the sample or in the population. Anyway, this wasn't supposed to be a thing about gender, but it's going to keep coming up, especially as trans rights and LGBTQ rights and things are constantly under attack from all sides. But the point is, understanding data is a skill. It's a skill you learn. It's the skill of statistics and statistical assessment based on mathematics. And while they have terms that scare people and people don't want to do math, the most important thing, in my view, is to make sure that you examine the data set and take a look at the outliers. Were they ignored and why? What is the distribution of this? Are we dismissing groups or populations that should be included? Because sometimes that's the right thing to do based on what the focus should be. Sometimes it's the wrong thing to do because we have the wrong focus. I'd hate to see the same sort of statistical dismissals and mistakes that are frequently used to marginalize queer people, to marginalize other groups, also be used to marginalize atheists or agnostics or freethinkers or secular humanists or whatever the category is that you identify with the most. To have you sidelined and your rights sidelined and your value sidelined from national and international conversations because somebody has it in their head, everybody's either Protestant or Catholic. Everybody's either Christian or Muslim. Everybody's either this, or this, and nothing else counts. You're all so statistically insignificant because in many cases, we're talking about millions of people. But from a secular humanist perspective, even if we're just talking about one, there's still value. Thanks for listening. Hope everybody is doing well. We will see you again next time. Take care.